Hello and welcome to all to our today's much awaited webinar, Impact of New US Tariffs on India. I welcome all our distinguished speakers and IACC members who are here to present their views and their insightful ideas with all of us attending today this webinar on the effects that the new tariff which is being laid on India is gonna present. So please join me in welcoming our first distinguished speaker, Mr. Mark Linscott, who's the former US Assistant Trade Representative, Mr. Vijay Chauhan, Executive Director, Tax, Deloitte, Mr. Neelkanth Mishra, Chief Economist, Axis Bank, Mr. A. Sekhar, who is the National President of Indo-American Chamber of Commerce and also the CEO of Spike Power, Mr. Stephen Mathias, Chairman of Indo-American Chamber of Commerce, Karnataka, and Senior Partner of Kochhar and Company, and Mr. Nilesh Vikamsey, Regional President of Indo-American Chamber of Commerce, West India Council, and also a Senior Partner in KKC and Associates LLP. A very warm welcome to all the speakers and panelists, and thank you so much for giving your time and for this wonderful webinar and the topic and discussion. So Stephen, we would like to hear from you and what we are expecting in this particular webinar and what our attendees can look forward to.
Thank you, Amrita. Welcome, everyone. Good evening and good morning to all of those joining from the US. As you are aware, India is facing tariffs with regard to the export of goods from India to the US. It began on April 2nd, when the US imposed 26% reciprocal tariffs on India, then put it in abeyance, hoping to reach a tariffs deal with India, which unfortunately did not happen. And then the US imposed a 25% tariff and then followed that up with another 25% relating to India's purchase of oil from Russia. So we're now faced with a 50% possible tariff, which would kick in later this month. It's possible that trade negotiations will still continue. We have a distinguished panel here before us. My two colleagues from the Indo-American Chamber of Commerce. In addition to that, we have Mark Linscott. I'll tell you a little bit more about Mark. He's a former Assistant US Trade Representative for South and Central Asian Affairs at the Office of the US Trade Representative, where he worked in different capacities for about 16 years. He's also the Senior Advisor for Trade Policy at the US-India Strategic Partnership Forum. But more importantly, Mark represented the US government during its trade negotiations with India during the Trump 1 presidency. Welcome, Mark. We also have Vijay Chauhan, who is an Executive Director Tax at Deloitte. He's held numerous positions within the Customs Authority in India, including Commissioner of Customs at Mumbai, been at the Customs Authority for Advanced Rulings, and the Principal Commissioner of Customs ICD Imports at Delhi. Vijay is also the Senior Visiting Fellow at the IACC Center for Public Policy at Ashoka University. And we have Neelkanth Mishra, who is the Chief Economist for Axis Bank, one of India's leading banks. He's also the Head of Global Research and member of the Board of Axis Capital. Neelkanth is a frequent commentator in the Indian media on the Indian economy and the state of Indian markets. We'll begin with a welcome address by Sekhar, who is our national president, who will talk to you a bit about his feedback from Indian industry, particularly Indian companies who are exporting to the US. Over to you, Sekhar.
Thank you, Stephen. Good evening, everyone joining in India, and a very good morning to my friends and colleagues in the US. It's a privilege and a responsibility to open today's webinar. We have gathered here not just merely to discuss a policy development, but to examine the moment of significance in the ongoing story of the Indo-US economic engagement. Over the last few decades, India and the US have steadily built the most dynamic economic relationship. Our bilateral trade grew tenfold in the past 20 years. We touched 200 billion. We have moved from being just partners in selective sectors to become deeply integrated in areas ranging from technology and pharmaceuticals to services, manufacturing, and investment. And yet, as with every long and meaningful partnership, there are moments of challenge. The current moment of challenge that tests our ability to adapt, innovate, and look beyond the immediate. The recent tariff announcements by the US is one such moment. For Indian exporters, these measures raise real and urgent questions. Which sectors will feel most sharply? How can we mitigate disruptions to supply chains and competitiveness? And crucially, how do we turn a potential constraint into an opportunity for growth and diversification? In such times, Indo-American Chamber of Commerce has played its very important role. For 55 years, we have been a trusted bridge, bringing together business leaders, policymakers, and experts from both nations to not only debate issues, but to chart what practical solutions we can do. Today, I have an exceptional panel, which already Stephen has already elaborated. I would not like to waste time on that because all of you are looking forward to their presentations. Their insights will not only help us understand immediate implications of the tariffs, but also inform how we respond as a business community and as a nation. In IACC, we believe in three guiding principles. Clarity, to understand the challenge in its full dimension. Creativity, to find solutions that are both practical and forward-looking. The third is commitment, to act decisively in the interests of Indo-US economic progress. That is why today's discussion actually matters. It's not about predicting what is the future, it's about shaping it. The decisions we make, the collaborations we forge, and the strategies we adapt in the coming months will influence not just trade statistics, but jobs, innovation, and shared prosperity for years to come. So I urge all participants to engage actively, ask bold questions, and think beyond sectoral boundaries. Let us approach this issue not with apprehension, but with ambition, and not with a mindset of limitation, but of possibility. Indo-American Chamber, I'm also making a request to all our non-members who have joined into this interesting webinar to tell you that we as a chamber can offer a lot of, being a bridge with you in increasing your trade. And I recommend you all to seriously look into your membership to join us and build a strong, which will enable a benefit on a win-win basis to everybody. So thank you once again for all of you joining us. My sincere gratitude to the distinguished speakers for sharing their time and wisdom. Let us now begin what I am confident will be a meaningful, constructive, and a forward-looking dialogue. Thank you.
Thank you, Sekhar. I'll begin with Mark. Mark, we're trying to understand what happened here because it seemed like India had started negotiations with the US in February. That was well before the reciprocal tariffs announcement. And it always seemed like India might well be the very first country to sign a deal with the US on tariffs. But it didn't seem to happen. So what do you think went wrong, and what do you think were the key points of disagreement?
Well, thank you, Stephen. Let me start by highlighting the comments from Sekhar about the nature of the U.S.-India economic relationship. I was heartened that he highlighted how much it's grown in recent years, how vital it is, and also the sentiment that perhaps this should be a moment to seize an opportunity to go further. It might be a bit ironic to say that under the circumstances with the tariffs, but hopefully there is that opportunity going forward. In terms of what happened, it's It's hard to dissect very precisely, but I think centrally what we saw here was the fact that President Trump is the trade negotiator in chief of this administration. He is the final decision maker. He seals all of the deals that have been done so far on reciprocal tariffs. As you noted, the US and India had a head start. They started back in February, and in substance in March. In February, we had Prime Minister Modi's visit to Washington. They issued a joint statement. That joint statement was quite robust, and it highlighted trade and laid out the aspiration, the ambition to negotiate a comprehensive bilateral trade agreement, a BTA, and the first tranche of that to be done by the fall of this year, 2025. So things got off to a very good start. I think the government of India, the Modi administration, was very savvy in seizing the opportunity. Um, and negotiations were well underway in March. The two sides were getting together. The ministers were involved, and on the U.S. side, that was Jameson Greer, USTR, and Howard Lutnick for the Department of Commerce, and on the Indian side, Piyush Goyal for the Ministry of Commerce. And they focused almost immediately on tariffs, and this was prior to the April 2nd so-called Liberation Day announcement. And, it was my sense that India was making some unprecedented offers that could really advance the relationship on trade. Many of us were predicting that a trade deal was getting close. In fact, members of the administration and the president himself forecast that a deal was coming soon. We had Scott Bessent, the Secretary of Treasury, Kevin Hassett, who's the chief economic advisor, Howard Lutnick making public comments about the likelihood of a deal soon. And by early July, the negotiators had pretty much concluded their work. And I think there was a lot on the table for an so-called interim agreement, a deal on the reciprocal tariffs, not the larger bilateral trade agreement, but a first step in that direction. What we didn't factor in, we should have, was that President Trump would want to review this and make his own decision and be involved in concluding a deal. And we then saw that play out with other countries. First with with UK, which was in a different situation and was the first to go. But then we had Vietnam, a country with which the United States has a large trade deficit, which has done very well in recent years with the de-risking from the Chinese economy. And that deal was for a 20% reciprocal tariff. And at that moment, it was the reference point. Indonesia followed at 19%. And I think this was all concerning for the negotiators because it was pretty clear that India would not agree to a reciprocal tariff that high. When Japan was done at 15%, that seemed like it was more in the ballpark potentially for a deal, perhaps closer to what the negotiators had been working on. And I think the Japan deal, followed by the South Korea deal, the EU deal, were real opportunities to see something similar happen with India. But what each of those trade deals involved was the president speaking to his foreign counterpart, the foreign leader, or in the case of South Korea and Japan, the trade minister being in Washington, being called into the Oval Office, having an audience with the president, and the deal being struck in that way. So we didn't really have that opportunity with the United States and India for a number of reasons. There were some developments that were that complicated the situation. President Trump's comments on his intervention on the conflict between, the terrorist attack and the ceasefire made it much more politically difficult, I think, for Prime Minister Modi to engage directly with the president on concluding a trade deal. And, ultimately, I think that is what didn't happen. That was the missing component. I don't think it was some last minute differences over agriculture or other commodities. I think it was the lack of that top level engagement, and then things went downhill from there. Several weeks ago, with the president's posts on Truth Social regarding Russian oil, that blindsided many of us, and has provided an added complication to further efforts to get a trade deal. I'm still hopeful, but this is a difficult moment to say the least.
Shall I take on, Stephen?
Yes.
Vijay, the initial reciprocal tariffs pegged India at 52%, level, and then half of that was applied at 26%. We finally ended at 25% before the additional 25% new oil-related tariffs came up. Trump has stated that India is the tariff king. Are we the tariff king? Do we have high tariffs? And has there been an increase in tariffs over the last 10 years? How does Indian tariffs compare, to those of our peers?
Thanks, Nilesh. So there is no denying the fact that India has very high tariffs in absolute terms. So when we look at the average tariff across what is called the different HSN, it works out to about 17%. And when we look at the trade weighted average, in the sense India doesn't import goods under all of them. So when we use the trade under different heads to calculate the effective rate, it comes down to about 13%. Now, none of our peers have anything in the range of double digit. So at 13%, to be at definitely 3%, 300 points or more higher than any of our competitors, including in the Southeast Asia, our tariff rates are higher than Bangladesh as well. So there is no denying the fact that India's tariffs are high. However, whether we are tariff king or not depends on which is the date that we pick. Prior to 7th of August, we were the tariff kings. But if highest rate of tariff is the criteria to determine who's the tariff king, as we speak, United States would have that crown, snatched away from us. The second thing is that, the US rates before that was actually 3.3, that was the normal rate, and 2% effective rate. Now, both India and the US were living within what was called the WTO bound rates. When the WTO World Order was decided, the developed countries took to have a lower tariff rate than the developing countries. And as I said, that India does have a higher rate of tariff than everyone. Now, tariffs as a tool may serve a lot of purposes. There are people who advocate that, and there are people who say that it doesn't work as effectively. I will not list the beneficial impacts of the tariff or the purposes it can serve. The current US administration has highlighted all of them. I will just highlight two of those. One is to attract industries domestically. As you create a tariff wall, the expectation is that some of the industries will shift to the country of origin. I have been fairly closely associated with the role of tariff in development of the automobile industry in India. That's been a work that has taken 20 years. 2000, when the tariff was used to bring automobile industry into India, not many people gave it a chance. But the fact of the matter is that if there was a dispassionate analysis of what helped, tariff would have played a positive role. More recent articles talk about similar impact on the toys industry as well as on bicycle. A more detailed analysis is not available. The second important role that it plays is that of revenue. There is a question about, whether when you impose customs tariff, whether the duty is paid by the domestic consumers or the foreign importers. Smaller analysis that we have seen is that it falls somewhere in between. But in a political economy, the preference for customs vis-a-vis income tax plays far more importantly in a democratic country than perhaps in other countries. We're talking of India and US, and you would notice that in not so distant past, both the countries have attempted to increase customs revenues and reduce the income tax. The reasons for that are more political than economic. Most trade, fiscal policy economists, as well as experts in the area, will say that income tax is a better tool. But there is a large political constituency which prefers to have revenues raised through customs duties, and it serves a lot of other purposes, including having a barrier for domestic industries to grow. So that's the scenario we are in currently. Yeah, over to you.
Thanks, Vijay. I do note that I saw an interview with Dr. Raghuram Rajan, where he said he recommended that India reduce tariffs across the board for all countries, not just for the US. So perhaps I think the points you made are really relevant there. Neelkanth, turning to you, let's leave aside the 25% tariff relating to Russian oil. But just let's look at the 25% that has been imposed. How do you see that affecting the Indian economy, and what do you think are the key industries that are going to be affected? And when you see competitors who are more around the 20% mark, which is like a 5 to 6% differential, do you think we are still competitive with them?
See, let's look at the big picture impact. Assuming that the duties on electronics and pharmaceuticals, which currently are going through the 232 investigation, also come in at a certain rate, the total tariffs that are due in dollar terms on India's exports to the US would have risen from, say, about $2.5 billion last year, CY24, to about $7.5 to $8 billion by April to June, because June was when the 50% on US on the steel and metal imports, and that 7.5, 8 because of this becomes 18. So there is a $10 billion increase. Given that, as Mark was saying, I mean, there are very few countries which are at 15 or below. 15 is pretty much the minimum that India can hope for. That number would have been about 12. So we're talking about 12 going to 18. And if we were at where Indonesia, Vietnam, 19-20% levels, as you said, then we would have been at about 15. So there is a $3 to $6 billion of problem. The next question is how much of it is going to be borne by the exporter, how much of it is going to be borne by the importer. You've seen President Trump demanding that the Goldman Sachs economists be fired for saying that a large part of this will be borne by the US consumer. For what it's worth, and thankfully you cannot influence Axis Bank, I do think that most of the burden will be borne by the US consumer. See, if the US is going to collect about $500 to $600 billion in total import tariffs, who's paying for it? So there are only three types of entities that will pay for it. One is the exporter, second is the US importer, third is the US consumer. Now, if you assume that 2%, 2.5% becomes 18%, which is the weighted average number for the US right now, that there were exporters to the US who had such fat margins that they can absorb this level of tariffs by themselves, I think you're completely mistaken. these are very efficient markets, and therefore the margins were actually quite thin. In addition, as we are seeing in analysis coming out of the US, nearly 1/4 of US imports of goods are by very small firms, the US importers of firms less than 500 people, and they have zero bargaining power or very limited bargaining power when they talk to suppliers. So if you're a very large US retailer or a very large US auto company, you can arm twist or you can have hard bargaining terms with the suppliers. But the smaller ones will, and there the incidence of the import tariffs will be nearly a third of the total, so $202 billion. So a large part is already getting transferred to US consumers. Now that we have tariff clarity, the likelihood of US consumer prices going up meaningfully in the next 2 to 3 months is quite meaningful. The second aspect is how much of business can get shifted. Remember that finding capacity at scale is always a challenge. So there are a few products, there are a few segments where there may be spare capacity. And remember that China is more or less out of bounds. I mean, as of now, it seems that President Trump loves China more than he does India. And if that is more of a strategic sort of shift, meaning that he doesn't want the Taiwanese president to be visiting Washington. And so there are all kinds of things that are now up in the air. So if he really wants to get strategically close to China and discard all his old allies, then we are talking about a very different problem. But if that is not the case, then US buyers cannot be tapping into supplies which are in China. And therefore, we have to see whether Vietnam or Indonesia or any other peers have the scale of capacities that India was providing. In addition, remember that there are many variables at play. So when we were discussing India versus Vietnam or India versus Indonesia, it was the USD INR was at close to 84, 85. Today it is at 88. So 5% has just depreciated and the USD VND is kind of flat. So, and the fact that the dollar has been falling against every other currency, the rupee's weakness actually offsets nearly 5% of the impact. For that matter, not relevant to this current discussion, but extremely important from a global perspective, the real effective exchange rate of the Chinese yuan is down by 18% in the last 3 years. So even as we talk about large duties being placed on Chinese imports from China, because China's inflation is zero and everywhere else it is 2, 3, 4%, Chinese are becoming more and more competitive every day. So coming back to your question, I think the sectors where if you do the simple arithmetic, which are the worst affected, of course, there is gems and jewelry, there is apparel and footwear, and there are several toys which I think will get badly affected. But remember that this is just the initial impact. First, as you rightly said, and my expectation is also that an extra 25% most likely will not see the light of day. But even at 25%, I do think that there can be significant diversion. I'll just end with a set of facts on what happened after the Trump 1.0 tariffs. You would expect that between two countries, so suppose there is US on the one side and China and Hong Kong on the other, that if US says that we are importing X from China and Hong Kong, and China and Hong Kong are saying we are exporting Y to the US, X and Y would be broadly in the same ballpark. I mean, they need not match on a day-to-day basis, but they will be in the same ballpark, which was broadly the case till 2017. So the US, the X was $40 to $45 billion higher than Y, which is understandable. Exports are generally FOB, the imports are generally CIF. What we have seen after 2017, so between 2017 and 21, that plus 40, 45 became minus 114. So what is clearly starting to happen, what has happened, is significant under-invoicing and transshipment. So the China says that in things like clothing, China says they've shipped 100. The US says they've imported 55. So there is a significant amount of diversion that happens, especially at a time when the US government capacity itself is getting constrained. It is quite likely that things like gems and jewelry, for example, I mean, it's just a hop away to Dubai and then exporting it at low rates. So I don't think these are really the impact that will be felt by Indian exporters.
Thanks.
Thanks, Neelkanth, for the fantastic insights which you gave. Just taking the last point forward, what Neelkanth you mentioned, Vijay, do you see that the Indian exporters will find some kind of a solution to continue the exports, like what example Neelkanth gave, shifting base, to other countries, whether it's Dubai for gems and jewelry, or there are other countries being talked, Sri Lanka, etc., Bangladesh, by doing the required value add. I think each country will have some value add requirements. But I understand these provisions on transshipment and general custom laws have rules relating to country of origin. How does it pan out? Is it so simple the way Neelkanth said? Today say there is either 25% duty tariffs or 50% or whatever may be. It evolves. But just, the exporters will shift base. Is it so easy with your experience in the customs? Can you just give some insights on that to us here?
Yeah, thanks. So I agree with Neelkanth that, this is an unstable equilibrium. Most likely 50% will not stay. Most likely it will be 25%, or if we have a BTA, it will be slightly lower. What is not going to go away perhaps is that there will be differential rates of tariffs imposed by the US on different countries. To understand, and the second thing I want to say is that there is a huge service sector across the world whose sole job is to reduce the incidence of taxes on the companies. They do their job, and to understand what are the different ways in it can be done, I will highlight some basic points about customs. So the tariff is normally imposed on an ad valorem basis, X percentage, 50% of what is called the assessable value. Now, we also notice that this 50% is not uniform across what is called the HSN. It can vary from 0%. Like if we were to look at India's tariff, it will vary from 0% to 100%. So where the goods get classified determines what is the tariff that would be applied. So first is, where will the good be classified? There are opportunities which are available to change the classification because that is determined on the basis of the form in which the goods are imported. The second thing then comes is the value. What is the value on it will be charged? And there, as Neelkanth was explaining, the difference between the FOB and the CIF. Now, India charges duty on the CIF pad. The US has a very interesting principle which is called the first sale. First sale essentially means that if the goods were destined to be sold and eventually exported to the US, the point of first sale would be the value on which the duty would be chargeable. Now, if that intermediary could be created in India, that intermediary could be created in Dubai or elsewhere. Now, when you do that, and there are certain conditions which are to be adhered to, that is the job of the Customs and Border Protection in the US to ensure that they are. The US Customs Administration has not really been challenged to collect revenue over last many, many decades. None of the officers working today actually have the expertise of taking the due diligence which is required to ensure that whatever was due has been collected. So the third thing was, and that is where the most substantive change is happening, is that MFN rate. There, the duty was applicable only depending on the classification and the value, unless you had a free trade agreement in which you had elaborate rules of origin. Now, what the US has done is it has different rates of duties for goods coming from different countries, and they still don't have a very precise rules of origin. What they have is a general principle called substantive transformation, and they expect entities to go and seek advance ruling on that. And though they're fairly efficient, they would just be, overloaded with the kind of queries that would be coming. Now, till the origin gets decided, what will happen is one of the opportunities of transshipment, and the other opportunities would be of what we call as unbundling the value of goods to strip it of all the extra, let's say, after service, after sales services, royalty, etc., etc. And the tariff would then be paid only on the stripped down value of the goods. However, if someone was to attempt to do that in India, the customs comes after them very harshly. Whether the US administration at the CBP level or at the policy level would adopt more lenient or more conservative way is actually going to determine how much is going to be the actual incidence of this duty. One of the other things that the US administration has done is that there is a principle called de minimis. De minimis essentially means if the size of the consignment is less than X, you don't have to pay duty on it. The US had the highest de minimis level, which was $800. That goes out the window from 29th of August. So the number of transactions and the documents which the US administration will have to handle to collect the revenues would jump phenomenally. Now, how they go about doing it would determine how much of transshipment, how much of reduction or softening the impact that the industries would be able to. But I do believe that if the rate of duty was to be 25%, Neelkanth pointed out very helpfully that 5% is already taken care of by the exchange rate variation. The other day in the parliament, it was told that only about 55% of the Indian goods exported to US attract tariff. So all of them will play out. So there would be certain industries, particularly labor-intensive ones, which are more catering to the US would suffer very serious impact straight away. And the kind of play that they do have plays, but it would require perhaps a kind of assistance and some support from the government and the industry associations to kind of help them negotiate this. Yeah, back to you.
Well, thanks. Wonderful insight, Vijay. Thanks. Neelkanth, just on a different question, is there scope for reducing Indian tariffs? Will that actually be good for India? I'm thinking here that if we reduce tariffs even without a deal, and the Russian oil tariff goes away, we may get close to 19-20% like our competitors, the other countries. There is also an argument these high tariffs are not actually good for the Indians. So what's your take on the Indian tariffs? I'm saying just on a different wicket.
No, absolutely. I think we have, in most sectors, I think we have been giving undue protection. I mean, someone was pointing out that when the average tariff rates were being calculated, someone found that on sausages there was 118% import duty. And someone asked, so ye kahan se aaya? I mean, why did this happen? So someone from Surat had come and promised, oh, we will do so much of sausages and all that. Anyways, the point is that we have, I think, a clear need to bring down, we have to become more competitive. I think it's generally good practice we can have strategic sectors where, for example, there are other things like, say, GM. Now, GM corn, GM soya, I mean, we have kind of bound the hands of our farmers by not allowing them access to better quality seeds. You must be aware that in even BT cotton, we had allowed GM cotton, but then to promote domestic seeds industries, we restricted again, and then again our yields are like 1/3 that of China. So if we unless we are enabling our local guys to compete, we are kind of opening up them up for slaughter. So in fact, that's a good reason why we should open up those sectors also, that we allow many of these things. So as one global leader had said that India doesn't change because it's large and it's complicated, and it never gets existential threats. It is at times like these that I think consensus building becomes slightly easier when people realize that in collective interest, maybe a few people may have to get hurt, but it is in the interest of the country that we open up. So I'm actually a big believer in open trade, allowing our manufacturers to become more competitive, forcing our manufacturers to become more competitive, and maybe having strategic selective areas where we need our own industries to grow.
Thanks.
Stephen,
You're on mute.
Yeah.
Stephen, you're on mute.
Yeah. Mark, I was looking at the types of deals that the US signed, and there seem to be like two types of deals. There's the kind of two-way fair deal, which they have with the EU, the UK, and Japan, which is roughly around 15%. I think with the UK, it's 10%. And then you have one-sided deals with countries like Philippines and Vietnam, where it's 19, 20% for their goods going to the US, and it's zero for US goods going to India. Now, the difference here to me seems to be that Japan and the EU have committed a huge amount in terms of investments into the US, something like $650 billion. Is that what's needed to get that kind of deal? Because I don't think India has the money to commit on that scale. I mean, I was just looking at if India decides to buy, say, 35 F-35s, which Trump wants to sell us, that's about $4 billion. So where's 4 billion and where's 600 billion? So how do we bridge that gap? How do we get to 15%, or is that just a mirage?
Yeah, it's a good question. I guess the easy answer is creative accounting. I think that's what happened with all of these deals with the EU, with Japan, with South Korea. Each involved the president at the very end sealing the deal. With the EU, it was with von der Leyen, the president of the EU Commission. With Japan and Korea, they involved the trade ministers being in Washington, coming into the Oval Office, having an audience with the president. And the substance of those final terms were all about hundreds of billions of dollars of commitments in purchases or investments. And that's what the president likes. He likes those headliner announcements of big purchases and big investments that his policies are working. And I expect that if there had been that kind of direct engagement a couple of weeks ago between Prime Minister Modi and President Trump on a deal, there would have been efforts on both sides to come up with some creative solutions. None of these so-called commitments seem to be legally binding, and there's no text of agreements. I mean, we as trade negotiators, and I spent my career doing that. I mean, you mentioned I was 16 years at USTR. In fact, I was 27 years at USTR. So that's what I did. And in negotiating agreements, that's sitting down and hammering out commitments, obligations, benefits in legal text form. And we don't have that with any of these agreements. So Japan, for example, has already provided their counter narrative on exactly what their understanding is that there will be the potential for loans and loan guarantees to the private sector, and this will be over time. These aren't legally binding commitments, and they do not involve the government directing certain purchases or investment. I mean, they can with respect to energy and military purchases, but it's more about facilitation of private sector activity. So, I think there was a scenario, and perhaps going forward, there still is a scenario that even reflects the fact that the two economies, as Sekhar had pointed out at the start, the two economies are becoming more and more integrated. There's been more trade, there's been more investment. That's only going to grow as India becomes the third largest economy in the world. So again, I think it's about creative accounting so that the president can announce this kind of deal. And then otherwise, in terms of specific provisions, I had the understanding that as the negotiators were working on issues, there was some give and take. I mean, it was not one-sided. It wasn't that kind of Vietnam or Indonesia scenario. There was some real give and take, working towards a more ambitious bilateral trade agreement. So, I'm still hopeful, even though we're in this low moment, particularly with the Russian oil situation. But I'm still hopeful. There's plenty of space to come together, to put together an interim agreement and then continue negotiations on the broader, comprehensive so-called bilateral trade agreement. And, on this notion of a BTA, for a lot of reasons, the United States is not negotiating free trade agreements, FTAs. That was true in the Biden administration, appears to be the case with the Trump administration. But in my view, BTA, legally not an FTA, but in substance, a comprehensive agreement covering goods, services, tariffs, non-tariff measures. It looks a hell of a lot like an FTA. And that is the ambition. I hope they do get back to the table to be working on that, because I think for the two economies, it would be a huge accomplishment during this Trump administration.
And I understand that India is the only country that's actually negotiating a BTA with the US.
Exactly. That is again, the leaders in February in their joint statement specifically referred to doing a comprehensive BTA. The United States, the Trump administration, has not agreed to do that with any other trading partner.
Okay. So one of the things that's been mentioned in the Indian press is that the whole issue of why we didn't get to an agreement was because of agriculture and dairy. Do you think that's the case? Because you mentioned compromises on both sides, significant compromises on the Indian side. Do you think that's what's actually holding it up?
Yeah, I'm not buying that narrative. I think it is an understandable narrative because if a deal were struck, it is politically beneficial to say we protected our vulnerable farmers, we protected these sensitive sectors in reaching a deal with the United States. But from what I know of the negotiations, I don't think there was a big push at this point for an interim agreement for a first deal. I don't think there was a big push on sensitive agriculture sectors like dairy. I mean, I think that there is a lot of understanding among U.S. trade negotiators on some of the sensitivities associated with dairy and the disconnect between the production of U.S. dairy products and sensitivities, cultural and religious sensitivities in India on dairy. There's an understanding and acknowledgement of that. And this goes back to the first Trump administration when there were efforts to negotiate a GSP deal. Dairy was on the table, but it was, I think the two sides were thinking of creative ways to approach that would that would adapt to or protect Indian sensitivities on those issues. So I don't think that's the reason there was not a deal in the last few weeks. I think it was the bigger dynamic of the president being involved and being able to make announcements that he struck deals with his counterpart, with Prime Minister Modi. That was what was lacking in getting to a deal.
No, thanks, Mark, for assurance that this was not, agriculture and dairy was not the real reasons. But assuming, Vijay, this question is to you, that this has been the sore point, assuming agriculture and dairy, do you see the US swamping the Indian agricultural dairy markets? I know yields are high in the US, but so are the costs very high there. Is there some kind of a compromise, assuming that they want the Indian market to open up to agriculture and dairy? Some level of tariff. I personally don't understand the prohibition of the GM crops or even the so-called non-veg dairy. Why not allow the import, but use certification so customers can decide for themselves whether they want to consume this product? We've seen the BT cotton issue coming up, the GM cotton some years back, about a decade or so back. So what's your take on this agri and the dairy sector?
No, I personally genuinely believe that India's tariffs are pretty high and they should be reduced, including on some of the agricultural products. When we talk of dairy, that or agricultural produce, there would be hundreds of lines where they're there. It's entirely possible that for the negotiators for the two sides to sit down and actually identify where reduction in the tariffs are entirely feasible or actually might be in India's interest to do that. Now, GM has a political connotation, and the decision on allowing GM food to come in is not something which would be determined by economic logic. So I wouldn't enter into that bit. So the point that there can be reduction in the tariffs, most of the American products, so to say, would be at the higher price points, and they don't really would end up swamping the Indian market, though giving away premium markets to imported stuff is something that the domestic industry quite often protests against. There are instances which one has heard of when I was in the government, in terms of that, by doing this, what you are doing is you're allowing the cream to be skimmed by the foreign entities, and we are left to only handle that. However, purely in terms of trade negotiation, there are two tools which are available. Tariff, unfortunately, and I believe gets more attention than it deserves. Why I say that is, one, that you can reduce the tariff and introduce tariff rate quota, TRQ. You can say that's what India has done vis-a-vis some of the products under the UK agreement. Now, once you do that, then you restrict quite bluntly the size of the goods that would be coming into the market. And that has been adopted. It's there in a whole lot of trade agreements that has been done. However, more important is non-tariff barriers. In fact, there is an entire body of literature which is available to say that the Western world, with the rates of tariff that the US and the rest of them had of, let's say, about less than 5%, the cost of what is called the non-tariff barriers are multiple times that. India also has this problem that, and we've continued to work to actually highlight this point, that even as India focuses on streamlining its tariff policy, more important perhaps is to address the non-tariff issues which result in cost to the industries. And in addition, there is an uncertainty about it, which is not good for India when we are aspiring to become a larger part of the global value chain and tap international markets. And quite often, a whole lot of products that go into it are actually imported. Yeah, John Endin.
Thanks, Vijay. Neelkanth, let's move to Russian oil. Is Russian oil so cheap? Is it that we must keep buying it? What's the price differential like? And if President Trump stays firm, we decide our exports are more important, because I think we're completely out of the US market at 50%. So then we decide we're going to move away from Russian oil. What's the impact on India from doing that?
So there are several perspectives on this. Let's start with the first question you had on the difference and what is the advantage for India. So a lot of the commentary that you get in the Western press and including from Western policymakers is based on what happened in the first year after the Russia-Ukraine war. So in 2022, the price gap between Brent and Urals, which are the two grades that matter. So Brent is the closest to the Indian average grade, and Urals is the Russian grade. That was $30 a barrel, so it was quite substantial. By 2023, it had fallen to about 20, 24 was 10, now it's $5. So you can buy Urals at the gate at $5 cheaper per barrel. Given that you don't get any insurance from global firms which are larger, you have to buy local insurance. So local meaning Indian insurance firms have to insure it, so that it adds to the cost. And so the landed price is about $2 a barrel cheaper. If you take about 1.5 to 2 million barrels a day, that's 550 to 730 maybe million barrels a year, and you do 2 to 3, maybe $3 also, it's $1 to $2 billion a year of saving. So I don't think it is financially now very important. Remember that 3 years back, we weren't really buying much of crude from Russia. So the reason why the gap has also come down is because, initially there was not much of infrastructure. Now, the infrastructure exists. Now, the question is, if India was to stop buying and there is no other buyer, so there are people who believe that then Egypt and Malaysia will step in and they will start taking off some of them. If that happens, then of course, then the disruption is minimal. But if India and China both stop buying and there is 2.5 to 3 million barrels of Russian crude, which no one else buys, global crude prices will go up. And so if you see Brent, which had actually moved up by $5 when this drama started, it is now back to $65. So basically, the oil market definitely believes that there is zero probability of any meaningful disruption in buying of Russian oil for anyone. Now let's see the intent. So one, of course, that the impact, that the reason why, in fact, I had a chance to interact with the sanctions coordinator of the Biden administration, and it was very clear that they started off by saying, oh, you know what, you have to stop buying. And you remember he had come to India and threatened India, why are you buying Russian oil? We'll put sanctions on India also. But very quickly, I think they realized that if India and China both didn't buy, the global oil prices go up, prices at the pump go up in the US, and that creates a political problem locally as well. So therefore, I think the Biden administration was comfortable with this. My understanding is that the Trump administration hasn't gone through the learning curve, so maybe they'll also adjust to this. The question now is, how serious is President Trump as regards this? Is it just a ruse, an excuse, or is he really serious about stopping India? I think it is just a ruse and an excuse. I think he may have been upset, as Mark was saying, that a final summit negotiation did not happen, and he just wants to trigger that. He may have felt that the two sides had come this close but not any closer, and therefore it's important to raise the stakes and somehow get them to talk again and bring that whatever summit level requirement that he has. And to do that, he had to find an excuse. If Russian oil was the excuse, he wouldn't be giving a 90-day extension to China, or ignoring comments like, why is the US buying uranium hexafluoride from Russia, or try to investigate why German car exports to Kazakhstan and Azerbaijan have actually shot up, because that's the route being used to ship cars from Germany to Russia. So, frankly, one who is clean in this one, and therefore being moralistic about who's really hurting the Ukrainians is something that we should not even discuss. And there's no clear message there, and therefore it is just, I think, a bargaining ploy, and sooner than later, I think it'll become irrelevant.
Just a time check. We are at 7 o'clock. Is it okay? We have got 3 questions amongst us between me and Stephen, and we have got maybe some questions from audience. We'll have a look at it. Can we go on for some time with the 3 panelists? Mark, Vijay, and Neelkanth, is it okay?
I'm fine with it.
I think, we have questions from the audience too. We should give them some time because we are with a time constraint. So look at it, and then if it is very important.
So what I'll do, Stephen, do you want to look at the questions, or?
Sure. Maybe if you look for the first one. In the meantime, I'll just ask Mark, do you think this Russian oil thing is to put pressure on India, or is it to put pressure on Russia, or what do you think is President Trump's aim there?
Yeah, I think it's the intent was to put pressure on both, and for perhaps for different reasons. I do think there is some degree of frustration on the part of the president that there wasn't a trade deal with India, and he reacts on a personal basis. The terms he used were quite provocative and aggressive, but there is clearly a Russia angle here. He is now directly involved in the Russian-Ukraine conflict. He does want to broker a deal. It's pretty clear that he harbors a desire to win the Nobel Peace Prize, and this is part of that. So, I think that there is a significant element of pressure on Russia, and we've got the meeting in Alaska on Friday. We will see what comes of that, whether it's positive or not. But I do think that a leader-to-leader level engagement between Prime Minister Modi and President Trump would help on both fronts, the trade deal front and the Russian oil front. And there being the potential for some kind of understanding on Russian oil that they're creative, a creative approach in terms of there being a transition, shifting, protecting the Indian consumer. All that could be part of a creative, probably a creative understanding on the Russian oil situation to avoid that 25%, that additional 25% tariff, because that would be devastating. I mean, that's pretty critical that it happen. So it has upped the ante. It's complicated things, but as again Sekhar pointed out at the start, this should be a moment of seizing the opportunity to come together, reach some understandings, and move together ahead. I hope that even at this low moment, I hope that can be the scenario going forward.
Thanks. So I just looked through a few questions, so I'll start with one or two. So one is, I think there was a question on whether the Indian IT industry is affected. So IT services is not part of this, only got to do with goods, unless anyone has heard anything different.
Not
No,
yet, not yet, not yet.
Not yet.
I mean, the only thing I would highlight is that, sorry, that the
Yes, Mark,
ambition.
go on. Yes, Mark, go on.
The ambition for a bilateral trade agreement, a comprehensive one covering goods and services, there will be, I think, future negotiations on issues like digital trade. In fact, there were already early discussions on principles for digital trade. So that will be on the table for a bilateral agreement. I think it's an opportunity for the two sides to come to alignment on digital trade issues, but it's probably down the road after we deal with the reciprocal tariffs and the Russian oil penalty.
Okay, and I think there are some sectors which are not subject to these tariffs, right? Because I heard one of the panelists say it's only about 58% of our exports. So I think pharma is one. What are these areas which are not covered by the tariffs?
Electronics, pharma are mainly. There are a lot more actually. As you rightly put, about 55% of the materials only are covered by them. And even among, this is only, we are talking of only merchandise. Okay, so.
No, but that 55% was only for merchandise. So it includes like energy is covered separately, metals are covered separately. So there are many sectors where, see, remember that the tariffs themselves are being imposed under various laws that empower the US president. So there is the Emergency Powers Act of 1978, I think, under which he's using this, but there are several other provisions like the Section 232, which allows him to, so this is where the metals and electronics the investigations are going on, metals are done. pharma, electronics will be there. So not everything. In fact, that's an even more interesting development that it is now being discussed in courts whether the president has the right to impose these tariffs. And there is also a market now for buying the rights to tariff refunds. That in case the Supreme Court in the US decides that the tariffs, that the president didn't have the constitutional authority to levy these tariffs, then the refunds will be issued. And from what I read somewhere on the net, there seems to be, there are people associated with the government whose family are actually buying the rights to these refunds at 20 cents to the dollar. So things are really interesting. But anyway, point is that not everything is subject to these reciprocal tariffs.
But your point is really important, the 232s. I mean, there's a 232 on pharmaceuticals, there's a 232 on semiconductors, which includes downstream products. And we're all waiting with bated breath for those decisions to be issued. And there's even a theory, and there's a group of us called the former U.S. trade negotiators. This is part of the initiative sponsored by the Washington International Trade Association. It's called Friday at the Exchange. It's basically grumpy old former U.S. trade negotiators talking about trade and tariffs. And we're all wondering whether the strategy on the part of the Trump administration, if they lose that case on IEEPA, is to have everything lined up for backup with other authorities like 232 and 301, so that they won't miss a beat in terms of continuing to impose tariffs, even if the use of tariffs under IEEPA is declared unconstitutional.
Nilesh, what's your favorite
Just one
question?
The one question which is coming up is, of course, on the applicability. The goods which are in shipment right now, from India to US, and assuming this 50% comes up, say within the end of this one, what happens if the goods land? I think possibly my understanding is the law is clear. If it lands after that date, so the higher duty tariff will be applicable. Is there any other view of the panelists thereon?
No, that's correct. The date is 27th of August. So there is a window that has been given so that the duty would be leviable at the higher rate only after 27th, unless, it is further deferred. As in case of China, we saw that it was to come into effect on 12th of August, and there is a 90-day further extension that has been given. So, what's happening is very interesting. Mark referred to a whole lot of them. There is a deal with the IT company that imports, if you commit to invest certain amount of money, then your imports will not be subjected to tax. There are also some deals that you will pay taxes on your exports to China on chips. So, there is actually nothing which is off the table in terms of trying to, get it's not very easy to figure out what the specific desires of the US administration are, but purely in terms of the tools, there seems to be nothing off the table. We were talking about duty on services. There was one announcement that there would be a levy on Hollywood movies, right? So if that, it's not been followed up, but if that was to happen, that would be the first thing in terms of the service being subjected to tariff. How and why, how it would be done is a different question. So, yeah, it's a very interesting time if you are not an exporter to the US.
I think a lot of the questions have been answered. One question, I don't know whether we should, just raising it for the sake of raising it, we may not answer. Is US administration looking at Indo-US relation only from the angle of tariffs? How about financial benefits which US is getting from the services which Indian companies are providing? Indian IT services, etc., and the cost savings arising out of that. Same with non-enforcement of digital tax on US companies like Amazon operating in India. I don't know whether we're going to take this up, but it is.
The most interesting thing to see is that if you look at the newspapers more clearly, you will see the advertisements for Trump Towers in India is going up. So even as the US administration says that US is not able to do business with India, there are telltale signs of the US president being able to expand his business within India. So, as Neelkanth said, some of the things we leave it unsaid, and not harp on it.
Okay, that's great. So I think we're close to wrapping up. I'd like to give each of our panelists just a minute each to recommend what should India do. We'll start with Vijay, then go to Neelkanth, and then finally Mark.
So the industry needs to look within and see what their supply chain is like, where the value additions are happening, because irrespective of what the tariff would be, that tariff would be much higher than the MFN. And there would be opportunities to mitigate the impact of it, including what percentage of it they would be able to pass on to the US importer and that entity to the consumers. But I would think that some part of it would be actually required to be borne by the Indian exporters as well. So they should prepare for it and look for alternate opportunities in the other countries and explore domestic markets as well. The government of India can step into support by facilitating essentially on the non-tariff restrictions or the challenges which are there, or entering the market in the US with greater clarity about the rules standardization. Because let's face it, lot more of Indian exports face non-tariff barriers in entering US than the tariffs. Indian exports to US have grown significantly, but they're hampered quite significantly due to the non-tariff issues on the borders. Means ask Indian mango exporters to the US the challenges they face every year.
Thanks, Vijay. Neelkanth?
Yeah, so I think the fact that these kind of threats can emerge is a very important wake-up call. I think it should accelerate the process of domestic reform so that Indian manufacturers become much more competitive, and that competitiveness can itself be actually a big counter to some of the tariffs and keep us even more competitive, even though we may have higher tariffs if that's what comes out of it. I also think that tapping into non-US markets is and diversification is something that should be explored. I mean, you don't know where the world is headed. So I think from a next 15, 20 years perspective, the global markets are going to get a lot more fragmented. Remember that the solutions that have been adopted by the US administration are not going to work. At least this one is not going to work. I mean, okay, most likely it's not going to work. But the problems they're trying to solve are very serious. So they have an overvalued dollar. They have a problem of depleting manufacturing. They're worried that if they get into a hot war with China, then they have a serious issue. And there is significant inequality, which is why this focus on manufacturing jobs. So these problems will mean that, and especially as the tariffs, if evidence emerges that tariffs don't work, they will try new things. And so we should get ready for more disruption. There is also likely to be much more of currency market volatility. So the trade weighted US dollar real effective exchange rate that is at levels where it was in 1971 and 1985, after which it fell by 30 to 35% over the next 3 to 5 years. The last two times it was slightly easier because you were only depreciating against the yen and the mark, the German mark. But now, of course, Chinese real effective exchange rate is actually falling as well, 18%. There are many advisors in Europe which think that the euro should be depreciating. So there's going to be significant currency market volatility. So we have to be, as we think about the next 5 to 10 years, I think we need to get ready for a lot of volatility going forward.
Thanks, Neelkanth. Mark, to you for the final words.
Sure. And I'll just add on to what Neelkanth highlighted. This is a Trump administration. We are going to have disruption. We are going to have chaos. That's just reality. I mean, it is what it is. And it does require many others to adapt. I mean, it's required the U.S. political environment to adapt, and I think that's true of foreign trading partners as well. And it can be done effectively. And I think doubling down on getting agreements is important. Our economies are just too rely on each other too much, and the potential is just too high. I mean, we have so many win-wins to seize, and otherwise it's lose-lose. I mean, we need to move ahead together, and so I think doubling down to reach agreements, which are in the interests of both countries. Pick up the phone. This will have to be done at a leader to leader level. I recognize there can be political costs associated with that. It requires setting emotions aside. But I think that's really important. And we look at what Japan has done, for example, which has played it pretty well. They did in the first Trump administration with the Abe administration, I think, and I think Prime Minister Modi played it well in the first Trump administration. So I think adapting and seeking to reach agreement is really, really important at this point in time.
Nilesh, I look to you to just give our concluding remarks as we end this session.
First of all, I would extend my sincere thanks to Mark, Vijay, and Neelkanth for it. It was a tremendous session. Coming the insights from Washington, from a person who's been in the trade, represented in that office there. Vijay coming from the Indian government perspective, I would say being in the customs and a lot of other departments. And Neelkanth from a macro and a micro impact perspective. So sincere thanks to all the three of you. My thanks also are to our National President, A. Sekhar, whose presence reinforces the importance of the subject across the entire chamber. And to you, Stephen, for sort of coordinating and piloting this whole session. So thanks are due to you and Amrita also. The topic we address, friends, today, the impact of new, is not only relevant, but essential to understand from strategic and policy. And the way the US tariff story is emerging, not only for India, but across the world from other countries also, is like a thriller movie, with suspense, twists, turns every day. And we at IACC are across all our regional council and branches, our goal remains unified to facilitate informed dialogue, enable constructive outcomes in the Indo-US trade relations. And today's session was a perfect example on how we do that by bringing together expertise, experience, and engagement. The recent tariff measures announced by the United States, whether driven by strategic competition, reshoring imperatives, or economic rebalancing, do pose challenges for Indian exporters, particularly in the sectors what Neelkanth mentioned, with apparels, gems, jewelry, maybe auto component, metals. I think that it will emanate. But I think Vijay gave a very good, sort of soothing thing that hardly 55% of the Indian, items are sort of subject to tariff and all. I think all this is emanating right now. That said, it's important to place these developments in a broader context. We are witnessing a global recalibration of trade and investment flows. And within that landscape, India has a unique opportunity to reaffirm its credibility as a reliable, resilient, and forward-looking partner in the global supply chain. Encouragingly, both India and the US have shown a consistent preference for dialogue over disengagement, as seen in the resolution of several long-standing WTO disputes earlier, and the willingness to collaborate even amongst geopolitical and economic shifts. So tariffs are only one part of the trade equation. They should not be seen as defining the entire landscape, nor should they discourage long-term strategic engagement. With increasing supply chain diversification and a growing appetite for trusted partnerships, India continues to offer compelling value as a manufacturing, services, and innovation hub. At the same time, the US remains as one of the most open, technologically advanced, and capital-rich markets for the Indian enterprises. So rather than viewing tariffs purely as barriers, we might also consider them as signals to adapt, to innovate, to rethink our export strategies, supply chains, and market approaches. Today's discussion offered us valuable insight on how businesses can mitigate risks, navigate regulatory landscapes, and leverage bilateral platforms to advocate for favorable outcomes. Let this not just be a conversation, but a catalyst for collaboration. Once our shared future lies in cooperation, not confrontation, and that's the spirit. That was the dialogue all the three speakers said. So with this, I want to conclude. But before conclusion, one last request, what our president said, to those members who are attending, those non-members who are attending this webinar, who are not members of our chamber, please join it. I'm sure it'll be, those who are on the Indo-US corridor, you'll keep on getting not only these type of webinars, a lot of other value add as far as the Indo-US trade corridor is concerned. So with this, again, a sincere thanks to Mark for joining in from Washington. Neelkanth, I know your schedule has been very, very hectic. You've been addressing all across the media. I've been seeing you regularly. Vijay, fantastic insights you also gave from, the tariff perspective. And to our own Sekharji, our national president, Stephen and Amrita. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for your time and for your presence. We could not have asked for a better, insightful, and such informative session. So on behalf of IACC, I would personally like to thank all of you all, to the speakers, Mark, Vijay, Neelkanth, and of course, the IACC team itself. Thank you, everyone, and have a wonderful day ahead.
Thank you.
Thank you to all the attendees.